So the title of the panel is Teaching Literary Translation. So we thought that it would be important not only to have people who do teach literary translation, but also to include people who have absolutely nothing to do with teaching literary translation whatsoever. We'll be discussing some various issues. I mean, all of us come from very different backgrounds. I think some of the things that were spoken about at the earlier panel today about a kind of divide between literary theory, particularly a sort of subset of it called translation theory, and this notion of craft, the teaching of craft as it applies to literary translation, which is a form of creative writing as well. Also issues of different perspectives from different countries. One of my preoccupations sitting in the US, given the fact that South Asian languages represent about 1/5 of the world's languages, but in a good year, only a few titles make it through outside India, outside of South Asia to the US. Vivek's book, Gachar Gochar, which was very widely acclaimed and well received in the US, was the first Kannada novel to be published outside of India since probably Samskara about a generation ago. So those sort of preoccupations of trying to have the voices that deserve to be heard from Indian and South Asian languages be heard outside of the subcontinent, and maybe how the kinds of things that we think about might differ from the classroom, for example, where Arunava teaches in Ashoka University to the classroom where I teach at the University of Chicago. But in any case, first I think they said we were going to start with Arunava, but I don't think we're going to start with Arunava. I think,
Why not?
what's that?
Why not?
Because he's protesting very. Would you mind if we started with you?
I would, which is why not?
So we're going to start with you, Rita.
That wasn't framed as a question.
I'm a very mean moderator. I apologize for that in advance. So one of the things that Rita does that, I mean, as we heard today, and this is true of the translation world too, is there is this divide between literary theory, translation theory, and the sort of practitioners of literary translation talking about craft. There are many literary translators who also engage in criticism as well, again, probably more on the poetry side, but there is this sort of envy and jealousy, particularly in the academy, whereby somebody in a comp lit department or English department may publish, let's say, monograph on why a particular piece of literature is important to translate, the significance of it, a very heavily annotated piece of literary criticism, and that will sort of count for them in their careers as academics, whereas if somebody actually translated that book and published it, that wouldn't necessarily count for their sort of tenure file. So given the fact that many literary translators do count on the academy for some sort of support, this can be a big issue. There are many who bridge this divide, like Lawrence Venuti and others. But I guess I'd be curious to hear from Rita about both her experiences as a practitioner of literary translation, her writing theoretical works on literary translation, literary theory, and also how this plays out in your own practice and in the classroom where you teach translation.
So, one is that departments in India are not sort of so divided between departments of translation and departments that teach literature. I've always been either in a literature department or in a culture studies department. But to me, translation informs my ethnographic work, whether I work in the villages of Kutch and write about people, or whether I'm interviewing partition migrants and asking questions about when they left Sindh, what happened when they were rehabilitating in India, or even in the teaching of Gachar Gochar or Samskara, there is a certain tracking back that I make students do to the languages that these texts would have come from, to the understanding that if we are reading, let's say, a Gujarati Dalit poem in class, what do you think might be the register of that Gujarati? Would that have been like a Sadhu Bhasha or a Chalit Bhasha? Would that have been, for instance, a more kind of Shushtu Gujarati, or would that have been more colloquial? So one of the novels that I translated called Angaliyat, which in Gujarati means someone who holds the finger of his mother or her mother and goes to a stepfather's house. And it becomes a metaphor of the entire Dalit community, in this case, the community of weavers, the Wankar community in Gujarat. And this is a novel that's written in what is called the Charotari dialect of Gujarat. So in teaching that, for instance, in the Dalit literature class at Ashoka, which I'm doing currently, to me the questions are somewhere the students do need to remember that this comes from a very specific local configuration, and what would it mean, what would that mean for this Gujarati to be in conversation with or in defiance for instance, standard Gujarati. So when you don't make language incidental to literature, when you also understand that language comes with its history, language comes with certain baggages, and language orders the experience of the world in a particular way, you are engaging with translation. How can you not? How can that concern be outside that framework? So we are doing Daya Pawar's Barut, which has been translated by Jerry Pinto. Once again, if I can't read in Marathi, I try and see if I can find the translation of Barut in Hindi or in Gujarati, which will at least give me something that's closer to Marathi for a student to know that what might be some of the verbal artifacts. The question is not one of gain or loss of translation, but the question is this acute awareness that I think a student needs to have, so that we know that these, in a multilingual environment, when a text is coming to you in a class, it is coming through a certain set of conditions. And you need, whether you speak those languages or not, you need to be aware that those conditions come with their own forms of symbolic, cultural, economic capital. So, to answer your question, Jason, my acute sort of an engagement with language as a sociological, as a linguistic, as a psychological phenomenon, and as something that is so central to human experience, is really what makes all kinds of work come together, where translation acquires the centrality that it does, whether it's in a classroom or whether it is in ethnographic work. So for instance, even when I'm doing ethnographic work and somebody is saying to me in Sindhi, because I work with several languages, and somebody is saying to me something in Sindhi, I'll just spend one quick minute. I know just one quick minute. So for instance, in the region of Banni, which sort of touches the border of Pakistan, Indo-Pak border at Kutch, where I worked, and there are these women in the villages who hardly ever go out of their homes, but they do very beautiful embroidery. So one had been awarded by the President's Award and came to Delhi. And I was asking her in Sindhi that when you came to Delhi for the first time, mind you, she will not even go almost 40 kilometers out into the region of Kutch, but she had to come to Delhi to receive the award. And when I'm asking her that, when you came to Delhi, did you go anywhere else besides sort of receiving the award? And she said to me in Sindhi, and she said, "Asanke khaso na lage." What it means is, this is again a mixture of Kutchi and Sindhi. And whether you want to call it Kutchi or you want to call it Sindhi depends on which side of the border you are and where your politics lies. So she says to me, "Asanke khaso na lage." What it means is, ये हमको अच्छा नहीं लगता, लेकिन इसका ये भी मतलब हो सकता है ये हम पे अच्छा नहीं लगता. It has both meanings. It does not behove us, or we don't like it. One has a sense of agency to say we didn't do it because we don't like it. Another one is to say, women don't just go and do sightseeing when they go to receive embroidery awards. So it doesn't look good on us. Now, the response is still in that liminal zone. It is still in that zone where I don't know whether there is an agency or a lack of agency. But to me, the fact that these are her words orders my understanding of where she was in that manner. So, to me, the question is not, translation is not a designated space in a department, in a room, in a class, in a course. To me, it's everywhere. So.
Thank you. If I could just pick up on a couple of your comments, that was very interesting. I mean, I think the idea, the notion of doing kind of deep ethnographic research in a particular place, I think can be very important to sort of train one's ear. But somehow, at the end of the day, particularly for translation, it does come down to sort of the ear into the target language. How does it sound? And the more deeply you can feel that it sounds at least analogous to how it sounded in the original from doing some of that deep ethnographic research, I think can be very important. Also, the question of dialect is a very, no matter what language you translate from, is a very interesting question. I mean, you don't want to make somebody from Kutch sound like some kind of redneck from Texas. I mean, dialect, you know, by definition is just so incredibly local. The great legendary translator Michael Henry Heim sort of talks about, at the very least, what you can sort of do is indicate that it's a non-standard form of English by, you know, dropping some of the final consonants or using more contractions or things like that. So at the very least, the reader or the listener will know that it's a sort of non-standard version of the language. But beyond that, you have to come up with some incredibly creative solutions. I mean, another legendary translator, Danny Hahn, has talked about literary translation as writing, but with the greatest number of constraints possible. So it's sort of like solving these puzzles and these riddles. And then finally, I think your last comment about what her reaction was when she came to Delhi, and how could that could be interpreted in at least two different ways, giving her more or less agency. One of the exercises that we do in our second year Hindi class, and I have a couple of former students here who I've subjected this to in the past, more than two, is reading 10 different translations of perhaps the most famous short story written, modern short story, Toba Tek Singh by Munto. So reading these 10 different translations, of course the question is who's translating it. Are they from India? Are they from Pakistan? Are they responding to another translation? And it's a wonderful exercise for the students because, first of all, it makes you realize how much interpretation is involved in a translation and how sort of slippery meaning can be. It's a very, very deep reading of the original text. And, you know, just how do you translate the word pagal, right? A very sort of garden variety, everyday usage word. Is that insane? Is it a madman? Is it a lunatic? Is it somebody who's mentally ill? And sort of the accrual of these, you know, small decisions that can happen at the level of diction, at the level of syntax in every sentence, not to mention, of course, all the cultural information. And that also links in with the question of closing the madhouses that dovetails in with the growth of MFA programs. So I wonder, Vivek, if we could turn to you briefly. I guess I'm curious about many things. One of them is, of course, your experience both as a translator. Vivek has translated into Kannada, one of the Hindi writers, Uday Prakash, who I translate into Hindi, but also has been translated beautifully by Srinath. So your experience maybe collaborating on that translation, to what extent it was a collaboration, you know, as somebody who is very much an activist and trying to bring more South Asian voices beyond the subcontinent, I'm also curious how this may or may not have changed your life as a writer, as a human being, to have had such a wonderful reception outside of India.
First of all, I'm not a MFA graduate, nor I am a formal student of literature. I'm an engineer, and I worked as an engineer for many years. I've been writing for many years in Kannada, and 3 years ago, and all through this time, there have been many requests from various publishers to translate my book into English. but somehow I didn't, I had not decided to do it because I felt that I need to spend a lot of time with the translator if I have to do this. Ghachar Ghochar is not my recent work. It is, I decided to do it because it was the shortest one. Yeah. So I met Srinath many years ago, and I liked his style of writing, and I consider him as a fiction writer, though he has not published any fiction, but he is a fiction writer in his mind and his approach. So that is how we decided to work on this. And the first thing I want to, which I told Srinath, and which is that it is not, the translation is not about bringing every sentence from what is written in the original into the target language, if I can use that word. But it is to bring what is not written there, what is unsaid in that work, bring that into another language. So that is really, for me, is translation. So, like literature is all about paroksha. Paroksha is, indirect cognition. One can roughly say that. So it is, you say something, you point at something else. Otherwise there is no literature. So this was really the most difficult thing in translation. This is the most difficult thing in translation. And so my discussions with Srinath, by the way, Srinath has this is his first translation. And probably this is the first book that he read till the end, Kannada book, right? And when I met him, he said, look, I have never done translation, and my Kannada is okay, but I can understand, but I have never done this. But I said, you write so well in English, so that's what I want. I said, don't worry about Kannada, I'll work with you, and then we can make this happen. So he read the book, and then he said, okay, fine, let's work on this. So that's how it happened. It took a year for us to do this. I'm not saying we worked on every day, for a year, but then on and off. Yeah, coming back to this, it was the discussions with him were never on the meaning of a word or the meaning of a sentence, but it is about about the secret of. I wouldn't have shared that with anyone else. Why I use a particular word, why I use why it has happened, and what does it mean, and this and that. So those were our discussions during the translation process. As I said that it's not about bringing a meaning. It's more about intention of what I wanted to do. Again, I'm not saying that it is the intention itself is a very problematic word, because I may have some intention and it might not have been realized in the book. It's only it's very arrogant to say that that I intend to do this and it has happened. However, that was. So that was a discussion that we had. There are many, I can give many examples, maybe, as we go along, I can discuss that. But other thing, which the difficulty that we had is the structure of the language itself, which is in the Kannada, the verb comes at the end of the sentence. And as a writer, I make use of it, So it's like it's a journey in a sentence. So you take the reader, step by step, word by word, and then when your eye meets the verb, that is when the meaning explodes in the minds of the readers. But in English, it's not. It's the other way, or almost the other way. So that was another difficult thing. So we had to deal with it, and I had to tell him, the intricacies of this. So I feel that though every sentence that is there in the original is in English, I feel these are two different books. It's the same story, it's the same thing, it's everything is same, but it's not the same. And yeah, there are many stories and many things around this book. I can talk about it a little later. But one more example I want to give is there are 3-4 sentences which were not there in the original, which were added in the English translation. And it was done because there was, in one place, there is a sentence which is like, Amma resorted to chemical warfare. And that Srinath added. And because it was in the original, that whole passage was in a very light tone, and that he could not get it. And then we thought we add this so that, it brings that lightness to the whole thing. So like this, we have some 3 or 4 sentences added here and there to do it. The other thing was when we did American edition, that the editors could not understand why people are sitting on the floor and cooking. So we had to add one more sentence there. So these were, 3 or 4 sentences that we added. That's about it.
Thank you. Maybe if I could just pick up on a couple of things that you said. I mean, I think one of the great joys of being a translator is if you're lucky enough to have a wonderful, cooperative, knowledgeable, living author, to have this very intimate experience with them of not only being able to sort of inhabit somebody else's skin as a writer, but also if you're lucky to have them share secrets with you that they might not share with anybody else. It's very special. And then also the structure of Kannada, where the verb comes at the end, which is also similar to Hindi. The Turkish translator, Maureen Freely, who translates Orhan Pamuk, where also the verb comes at the end, has this wonderful quote about sort of the experience of reading and trying to translate such sentences where you're waiting and waiting and waiting for the verb at the end is sort of like trying to bring home 6 weeks worth of groceries without any bags. So I think it can be a very difficult thing to do. And then finally, it's interesting that you mentioned the difference between the American edition and the Indian edition, because one of the things that translators of South Asian languages have to think about that, let's say, translators from French or German don't have to think about, is the fact that you have these 2 vastly different English reading audiences. One in South Asia that is going to be a lot more close to the cultural context at the very least. You can, probably either get away with or make a conscious decision to sort of translate less versus translating for, let's say, an American audience where, somebody's familiarity with South Asian culture might not go beyond like yoga and a, double foamy, triple skinny chai latte or something like that. And how to sort of balance not wanting, not feeling comfortable with catering to that person who only knows India through those things exclusively, at the same time wanting them to be part of this conversation because translation is about enlarging the conversation. So how to strike that balance. Would you like to go next?
That space seems to have been vacated by the publishing houses and taken up in university spaces. So someone like you works in a university. So, another example I had in mind was a translation of Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay's Hashuli Baker Upakatha by Ben Baer from who's at Princeton. Yep. So you people who have jobs in universities are actually able to now put in more time towards translations of this sort. When we were growing up in the 80s, you had these modern European poets. You had Pablo Neruda. Almost everybody was reading Octavio Paz in India, in Calcutta, where I was growing up. The thing about the availability of these books in bookshops and what it meant to actually read these paperbacks meant something else, I think, to me, even physically, to the sort of hardback editions that now come out from places like academic university presses in the US. So there's just that, there's a certain sense of loss I feel in that. Then this is not anything to do, so I'm not talking here about the quality of translation or anything at all. One thing I remember about the Neruda poem that we all read, and the one line that we all memorized, I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees, or something like that, which was not a very good line of poetry, but it was something that traveled, and something that everybody knew, and there was a certain currency to translation in that time when one picked up paperback copies of these from bookshops. That is different, feels different to me now when I pick up these tomes, these sort of hardback editions from, University of
sort of Columbia Press. So that was just something I wanted to flag. I don't know whether that helps in this discussion at all. The other was the question of dialect that you mentioned, and again so what wasn't mentioned was the role of decision. So, Hashuli Baker Upokatha actually tracks the story of this tribe, Kahar tribe, and the Kahar tribe speaks a particular dialect. So, Ben Baer, I think, had to decide at some point what to do. What does one do to translate dialect? And the decision it's a great translation, and I really enjoyed everything else about it. But the decision he made with regard to the dialect, I didn't agree with. In that he used American sort of Harlem, a bro, and words like that. To indicate the difference, that didn't. So perhaps because I read it in the Bengali.
Bro is never a good choice.
Right. So there are decisions that translators need to make. Regarding what the others were saying as well, it is so now to come to the practice of translation. So the only reason I'm here on this panel is because I've actually translated Rabindranath Thakur's letters written when he was a young man. This is the Chinno Patraboli, not the shorter glimpses of Bengal that he himself brought out, into this Penguin Modern Classic, which I titled Letters from a Young Poet, because he was a very young man when he sort of wrote these letters. Target language, the language that you're translating into, of course, as everybody, I mean, here I think would agree, is more important. That's the point you made, is more important than. So this point I make in relation to the fact that I was very hesitant. I'd never actually sort of, thought of myself as being able to do this. But the reason I took it on was because I grew up with Bengali and had Bengali in school. I know the Bengali, I can understand and appreciate it. I've never actually written in it. I've written all my life in English, so my expertise, so to speak, was in the English language. But I think that helped rather than as long as you get the sense of what you were saying about the ethnographic background. I already had that because I grew up in Bengal. So if I can just quickly, in a panel on translation, I was just saying to Jason before this began, we will be dealing with examples or languages that we don't understand. So forgive me, those of you who don't actually follow the Bangla, but I will try and explain a few things regarding my translation of these letters, as Jason has asked me to, by just quickly giving you a few examples from the letters. The one thing I wanted to say about this particular translation is, so again, we can perhaps talk about this. It's very difficult translating letters, particularly these letters, which are in their language and in the way they're written, sort of following a thought process almost. Syntactically, very challenging because, so this was a question I had. These are actually very well-known letters. This particular volume, Buddhadev Bose, who is one of our greatest Bengali writers after Tagore, said he carried it every time with him when he went outside of Bengal to Europe or America. He carried this volume with him. So the question I asked a well-known Bengali scholar was, why hasn't this complete volume ever been done? Why not? And part of the answer I got was that because of its difficulty. It's really difficult because of the syntax and the structure of the language and the manner in which the letters are written. Quickly, just to flag also that Tagore's poetry is also near impossible to translate, as everybody knows. That has different reasons from the letters. It's to do with the sound, the alliteration, the rhythm. Very, very difficult to get Tagore's poetry or song into the English language. It's just the manner in which he uses words. So I want to sort of quickly mention one example, which is from, I thought I'd, so this is, so very quickly. So this is just a phrase. I'll read the whole sentence and then I'll tell you what the difficulty was. সেদিন সন্ধ্যাবেলায় খোকাতে বেলাতে একটা বিষয় নিয়ে তর্ক হয়ে গেছে, সেটা উদ্ধৃত করবার যোগ্য। খোকা বললেন, বেলা আমার জল খিদে পেয়েছে। বেলা বললেন, দূর ভোকলা, জল খিদে বুঝি বলে, জল তেষ্টা। Okay, I'll just read that much. Now, this is just quickly translated. Is simply his son and daughter, very young, are talking to each other, and the boy who's younger says, "So now, how does one even give you?" So I won't read what I did with it, but in Bengali you say. You don't. Well, obviously, in any language, you say that I'm thirsty. Basically, but instead of that, he's saying I'm hungry for water. So this is so. Now the difficulty wasn't there. The difficulty was with the phrase "pogla." Now that is one word in Bengali that indicates that he has a gap in his teeth. He's so small that basically one of his teeth are missing. What do you do with, how do you, so there again, so the role of decisions, what do you do, what are, what are the words you use. That's to do with words. The other, and I think that's true of almost all translations from Indian language publishing we do, is mix of languages. What do you do when you have multilinguality is so much a part of being Indian that is obviously there in, I think, almost every work we translate from. So in the same letter, at the end of that paragraph, the child is saying, "Oh father, ekjoner সঙ্গে আমার ভয়ানক ভয়ানক friendship. she pagli, she এমন মিষ্টি. Oh, I can eat her up." So that's a sort of fun example, but the larger point I'm trying to make here is, what do you do when you, so obviously you retain the English original, and then how do you deal with the sort of the multilingual local, as Francesca calls it, in relation to Hindi. Two last points. One is to do with so long sentences, very very long sentences in these letters, stretching from almost the middle of one page going all the way down to the middle of the other. That's just I wanted to, but I realize I'll take up too much time. I won't read the original. Syntactic, so this is a decision, I think, again, I don't know whether it comes up in teaching translation, but it certainly comes up when you're translating, which is, what do you do with syntax and structure? Do you maintain that entire thing, or do you break it up for translatability? The decision I took with regard to these letters was to maintain it, because without maintaining that entire long sentence as it travels from this page into the middle of that, if you don't do that, I felt, perhaps wrongly, that you don't actually give a sense of the breathlessness of that entire, syntactical structure. So there was that. The last example I wanted to take was not from the letters and not from my translations. It's from a text that now almost, they're reading almost in every comparative literature department in the world, or even in literature departments that are teaching world literature, which is Tagore's Bishwa Sahitya, written in 1907. I did my Mellon lecture on that essay, and when I went to read it, I went to the English translation because it was just easier. I was in Oxford, friend had the Oxford English translation of, which was in a volume. I found I couldn't grasp what is he on about, I kept thinking, in the English, because it just became difficult for me to get at what he was trying to say. So I frantically emailed home, and the librarian where I work sent me PDFs of the original Bangla. It's only when I read the original Bangla that I said, okay, so that's what he's getting at, which sort of, it also helps if you have some background in, of course, what he's already said in many other essays to do with literature, in order to grasp what he's getting at. So one small example, for instance, a term in the original used that he wrote in the original was, he used the term Desh Kal Patro. Now, Desh Kal Patro is easily understandable to those who sort of know English. So place, time, and thing. Now, this was translated in the Oxford edition as context. Now, I thought it lost something. It's true. It can be translated as context, but I thought I needed to address this question of Desh Kal Patro, and I spent some time discussing that when I did discuss the sort of essay. So small things like that I just wanted to flag in relation to the practice of translation, at least, and I don't know how it would impact teaching translation.
Thank you. Wow. There's a lot I want to say because you raised many important questions, but I also want to make sure that Arunava has a chance to talk about his experiences in the classroom, and I want to make sure we have time for questions from everybody as well.
Yeah, and also because that is the subject of the panel. Yeah. So teaching translation, translation I always think is a bit like architecture. It combines the arts and the sciences, and you know, it's the perfect embodiment of the word "roop," which is a blending of form and content, and you can't really separate one from the other. Two kinds of teaching really takes place in where translation is concerned. One is the very nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts workshop kind of approach, where you're actually working with a specific text and a group of people who want to translate that text, and so then you're going straight into the practicalities. There's no philosophical assumptions to be made. There are questions to be asked, choices to be made, but you're not talking about the importance of translation or where it fits into the larger scheme of the universe. The answer, of course, is 42. But when we teach translation in an academic program, it's really a beautiful coming together of many different streams. So at Ashoka specifically, I'd say that it belongs to the larger rubric of creative writing. Translation is a very specific and very interesting form of creative writing. I know that there is a certain tension between those who think that translation is not creative work at all, but all I will tell them is that I know that dancing is creative, but try dancing on a tightrope. You'll know how creative that is. There's the whole idea of getting to know the traditions that you belong to. It's a sad truth that our college students today come into college having read very little. Let's not go into whose fault it is, but the fact is that because they've read very little, they sometimes discovered the literatures of India with great joy, because for the first time they say, I didn't know that literature was about my life. I always used to think it was about people in the West. So that's a second stream that comes in. A third point, of course, is the literature, and Rita knows this. Literature is and Rosinka, and Vivek, and you, Jason, most of all of us. Know that literature is the closest form of reading that there can be. You cannot read a text any more intimately than when you are translating it. When you're reading it, no matter how critical you are, you're still reading it very holistically. But when you have to make choices at the level of individual words, syntax, punctuation, breaking down syllables, you're reading it so closely, and then if you have a writer next to you explaining for you as you go along, that's one aspect, but very often you don't, and that's not a bad thing either, Jason. But then you're guessing and you're double guessing the writer. So you are reading a text in an extraordinary way, and I think recently, was it yes, I remember, it was a Scottish writer who said that the translator knows the text better than the writer. Which is true. He or she does. So this is a third aspect that comes in. While translation theory may seem very far removed from the act of translation, the fact is that as we are translating, we have to think a lot about how we are translating. And I'll say that theoretical aspects come into the whole process, if not a formal theoretical structure. So it's very important to be able to ask questions at every stage, to be able to make choices, know that you have to answer that question. There is no one answer. That's the best thing, perhaps. Every translator will translate the same text differently, having chosen to answer the same question differently. But it is important to ask the question. And that's what teaching translation is, knowing that you have to ask what are the questions you have to ask of the translator, of the text, of the author, and then finally of yourself, of the choice that you've made. So all these and many other strains come together in the process of teaching and learning translation. And what we found is that translation itself is also in the classroom perhaps not just as focused an act as taking a text from one language into another. It is also about moving a text between mediums. We've looked at how a text goes from words to film. We've looked at how text goes from film back to words, from words to dance, from words to music. We've looked at parallels between other forms of art. So when you are playing an African melody on an Indian instrument, is there an act of translation? worth thinking about and then figuring out if there are parallels. And perhaps most importantly, what we are learning ourselves in the process of the translation classes is that there is a process of interpretation that is involved. And while the actual, when you're translating a text for publication, you may want to really cut down on the amount of interpretation that you're doing. But as a creative exercise, it is wonderful to be able to try interpretative versions of an original text. So all of these come together in a number of different ways. And I'll just end with one point, which is that in India, for those writing in English, most of it is an act of translation, because 90% of your characters are probably not even speaking or thinking or living their lives in English. So you are translating in any case in your head if you're writing in English. So this formal act of a translation class actually hones that particular skill.
I'm not talking about untranslatability of that kind of a mechanical manner or even the linguistic manner, but also the fact that, what Vivek talked about earlier when he used the word paroksh, I think of dhvani, a certain unspoken, a certain sound, a certain meaning which is not that palpable and easily available. And sometimes I think it's important, whether in classroom or otherwise, to recognize this is not available to you. Be humble and say, I cannot translate this. And not just I. There is some arrogance in thinking that everything is available for you to translate. So for instance, there's a poem I did, and it's a disaster of a translation. It's in a collection called Modern Gujarati Poetry, which was one of my first translations way back in '98. And it's in English, it's called It Did Not Happen. In Gujarati, it's called Na Thaya, which means Hua Nahi. Kya nahi hua? And the poem gives you this series of situations of how you come tantalizingly close to a moment where there is fulfillment. And just when you think it would happen, it did not happen. So in Gujarati, it's organized in the form of a ghazal. It begins by saying, Aam achhta na thaya, aam ughada na thaya, हाथ फूलों में जबोड़या तोय सुवाड़ा न थया. हमने हाथ फूलों में डुबो दिए, लेकिन फिर भी हमारे हाथों में सुगंध नहीं आई. Our palms did not become fragrant, although we dipped them in flowers. And it goes on to say, towards the end, it sort of goes on to say how Ghair Avel Prasangoy Amara na thaya. Even festivals that happened in our own house did not become ours. And it ends by saying, Aaj varsad nathi em na kehta Ramesh. रमेश ऐसे मत कहो कि आज बारिश नहीं हुई. एम कहो हशे आपने भीना न थया. यूं कहो कि हुई होगी बारिश, हम गीले नहीं हुए. Right? We did not. Now whose fault is it? If it has rained, but if did not touch me, whose fault is it? What is this predicament where joy or fulfillment is just round the corner, but you are not able to get there? The entire thing in English, because of the passive construction, because English has so much agency, because English takes so much responsibility of a subject position, it simply did not work. It did not work because it is an ethos where to think that if something did not happen, nature is not to be blamed, you are not to be blamed, maybe the blame lies elsewhere, or maybe it is nobody's blame, maybe that's just the way it was. And it simply did not, the dhvani of that particular ghazal, I simply could not manage to do it. Now this is really a question of both theory and practice. The theoretical understanding is to say that there can be cultures who have the arrogance to think that they can capture every migrant experience, that you can actually iron it out, smoothen it, make it packageable for your own understanding. That is a theoretical understanding. The practical understanding is also to say that there is an entire structure of a ghazal, its subject position, its passive occupation, which English will not allow you to do. So really speaking, I think I wanted to come back to that not only is translation everywhere, I don't think even theory and practice are two different things. Very often they are the same. The question is, how much have you reflected upon the practice?
I think it is, you have made a very important point. When one writes, a writer takes so many things for granted when he writes in his own language or her own language. And that is not available the moment the text comes at the gate of translation. And which is why, when you write certain words, phrases, they evoke certain memories in one language. When you translate, it may not evoke the same memories. That is why something so profound in a language looks so silly in translation. And that is something, I felt that it is very good for a writer to be involved in the translation of his work, and it will do a lot of good to his ego and arrogance.